Hello, everyone, and welcome to our program this evening, Nazis of Copley Square with Professor Charles Gallagher. My name is Rachel King. I'm the Executive Director of the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center at New England Historic Genealogical Society, and I will be your moderator this evening. The Jewish Heritage Center is an archive and educational center dedicated to advancing the study and understanding of Boston and New England Jewish history. And we are located at America's founding genealogical organization. A few years ago, the Jewish Heritage Center received a request from Professor Charles Gallagher at Boston College to access the Jewish Community Relations Council records in our archives as part of his research for this eventual book. We have been awaiting the publication of Nazis of Copley Square ever since. And we are so pleased to have this opportunity, along with all of you this evening, to learn with Professor Gallagher about a little known and disturbing 20th century chapter in Boston and American history. This story, unfortunately, has profound relevance for today. Before we get started, I just want to make a few housekeeping notes about this webinar. You in the audience will be muted throughout and your cameras will remain off. If you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A panel at the bottom of your screen, and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can following the presentation. Please note also that we are all broadcasting remotely. So bear with us if we experience any technological issues, and even if there are glitches on your end or on ours, you will have access to a full recording of this session afterward. I want to acknowledge our partners for this event and our Boston neighbors, the State Library of Massachusetts and the Boston Public Library. I'd like to welcome now Beth Carroll Horrocks of the State Library and Diane Parks of the BPL. Beth.
Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to everyone here tonight. On behalf of the State Library of Massachusetts, I'd like to welcome you, and we join in great joy in being with our partners tonight from the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center and the Boston Public Library. We know that all of the members of the State Library's Author Talks Committee will learn a lot tonight from the perfect author to illustrate so well a topic that we all need to know more about. Diane?
Thanks, Beth. Hello, everyone. I'm Diane Parks, local history specialist at the Research Services Department of the Boston Public Library. We are very pleased to be able to participate in and support this important event, highlighting a critical time in Boston history, along with the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center and the State Library of Massachusetts. Rachel?
Thank you both and your institutions for sponsoring this program. And now for the main event, it is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker this evening, Charles R. Gallagher. Professor Gallagher is a Jesuit priest and associate professor of history at Boston College. His scholarly interests include American Catholicism, papal diplomacy, international relations, the Holocaust, and intelligence history. Among his prior books is Vatican Secret Diplomacy, published in 2008, and he is currently working on a few other book projects. In 2017, he was the William J. Lowenberg Memorial Fellow at the Center for Advanced Holocaust Studies at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. Professor Gallagher has just shared the news with us, hot off the presses, that this book has been nominated for the Grawemeyer Award in Religion, honoring significant contributions to spiritual and religious understanding. Congratulations, Professor Gallagher, and Mazel Tov. So please join me all in welcoming Charles Gallagher.
Thank you so much, Rachel. I'm super excited to be here. And thank you for that wonderful introduction. Also, thanks to Diane Parks at Boston Public Library. Many of the photos that we're going to look at tonight are from the archives, the photo archive of at the Boston Public Library. Beth Carroll Horrocks and the Special Collections at the State Library of Massachusetts. It's been a wonderful support throughout the project. And also just the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center is an amazing resource, state-of-the-art research able to be conducted there because of the amazing digitization of primary source resources that really make it a joy to work with as a historian. And also just finally, a wonderful thank you to Courtney Reardon, who is behind the scenes tonight, working the tech for the New England Historic Genealogical Society. I'm going to go ahead with Courtney's permission. I'm going to go ahead and share a screen and start a PowerPoint presentation about the book that has been 10 years in the making. And I'm going to bring that up on my screen right now. And this was one of the original drafts for the title. I'm going to get into the title, Nazis of Copley Square. Were there Nazis in Copley Square? Well, this is a very high-powered Nazi who we'll talk about later, a guy named Herbert Scholes. He lived in Boston from the fall of 1938 until July of 1941. In fact, he lived about a 5-minute walk from where I live at Boston College. He lived right on Reservoir Road in Chestnut Hill, at the only house in Chestnut Hill along there that has a tennis court, because he was an avid tennis player. And there he is pictured in the consulate, the German consulate in Boston in 1941. And this is his target for recruitment. Scholes, as we'll talk about later, Scholes was the diplomatic consul to Boston. He was a high-ranking SS officer and schooled in espionage. And one of the contributions I hope this book makes is to show his significance as a Nazi spy in the United States. One of the contributions I hope the book makes is that historians writing since the 1960s and 70s were using the most recently released World War II documents to talk about Nazi espionage in the US and to write about it. And they came up with the narrative that most Nazi intelligence officers were bumbling and stumbling and fumbling and couldn't put any good spy networks together. And my book kind of goes against that trend. I think that Scholes, who no academic has studied so far, Scholes was really an amazing spy master and did most of his dirty work in Boston to great effect. This man that you're looking at in the fedora is a guy named Francis Moran, grew up in Dorchester, ran a section of the group that was formed by Father Charles Coughlin called the Christian Front in the 1930s. He ran that organization in Boston, which I'm going to talk about now. And the reason there were Nazis in Copley Square is that Scholes bought and paid for a suite of rooms at the Copley Square Hotel, where Moran and his organization had their headquarters from the late 1930s through its suppression, its public suppression in 1942. The group was forced underground from 1942 to 1945. Again, nobody knew about that. And so I'll talk about that a little later too. So how did the Christian Front come about? What was the idea of it? Where did it emerge? It actually emerged in England. And this gentleman here in the middle is a guy named Arnold Lunn, later Sir Arnold Lunn. And he was a British aristocrat who, when matriculating at Oxford in the mid-1930s, converted to Roman Catholicism. He converted in 1933, he converted to Roman Catholicism. As a Methodist, from Methodism to Roman Catholicism, his father was a high-ranking Methodist clergyman in England. And so there was a bit of he had a conflicted view of his own self. And by the late 1930s, he decided that he would he stumbled on this idea of the Christian front as a way to heal the divisions between father and son. He noticed in the mid-1930s that during the Spanish Civil War, Roman Catholics were being persecuted by the Popular Front or communist government in Spain. He felt that this was an outrage, and his idea was to bring all Christians separated from the time of the Reformation, bring them together, back together with Roman Catholics through the creation of a Christian front, which would be a spiritual organization meant as a counterpoise to the advance of global communism. And so this was his idea. It originally was kind of a benign idea about ecumenism, in other words, bringing all of these religions together in dialogue. And he publicized this idea throughout Europe, and it even got into the halls of the Vatican. Once it got into the halls of the Vatican, it was spread throughout Central and even Eastern Europe, and was adopted by Cardinal Pacelli, who was then the Secretary of State, who would later go on to be the very controversial Pope during World War II. And in fact, Cardinal Pacelli gave a speech in Budapest in 1938 extolling the Christian front. And what most people didn't know was that Father Charles Coughlin, who was the most well-known priest, media priest in the 1930s, he had 30 million listeners. And from 1935 to 1938, he became increasingly anti-Semitic in all of his weekly radio speeches, which attracted millions of listeners, literally 30 million listeners a week on the radio. Father Coughlin in 1938, who had become increasingly anti-Semitic, was invited to join Cardinal Pacelli on the stage in Budapest to announce this idea of the Christian front. But for some reason, what the correspondence indicates is that Coughlin demurred and did not go to Budapest. I think he didn't want to share the stage with Pacelli and actually be upstaged by the Cardinal Secretaries of State. So both, you have this kind of merging of concepts in starting in Britain, moving to the halls of the Vatican, and then taken by Coughlin. He's operating, his headquarters are in Detroit. And what Coughlin does, and one of the reasons also I think he doesn't show up to be astride Pacelli, is that he mangles Lund's original vision of the Christian front. And he decides that due to the Catholic theological or philosophical tenet of legitimate defense, he's going to argue that Catholics have a right to, I guess there's something going on here with my video. Gosh. Is that back okay? All right, sorry about that glitch. What Coughlin does is he mangles the Christian front message and indicates that Catholics should be able to legitimately take up arms against the advance of global communism. And so, this message gets skewed by Coughlin. Now there's Lund as well. That looks like a strange picture, but when he wasn't philosophizing and theologizing, Arnold Lund spent winters in Switzerland, and he is known as the father of slalom skiing. So that's why you see him with his ski poles. In the book, what I try to do is integrate a couple of different theological impulses. This is kind of complex, but what I like to do as a historian is to look at the integration of political history. And in my case, I'm really focusing on intelligence history, or the history of espionage, and religion. And at the time in the 1930s and 40s, what Catholic theology was proposing was a couple of impulses that were dominant during the era, but simply don't exist today. One is the mystical body of Christ theology, which talks about, it comes from mainly St. Paul's letter to the Romans, that that Christ is the body and we are the arms and the appendages of Christ in the world. It's the part to the whole, the body to the head. And what this does is it means that when Catholics consider themselves to be the mystical body of Christ. So when Catholics were put up against walls and shot by firing squads, for example, during the Spanish Civil War, because those Catholics were baptized Catholics, that hurt the entire body of Christ. So what was happening in Barcelona had impact in Boston. The pain was felt globally. And that theology was a prime motivating factor for how these Christian fronters looked at themselves in connection to their co-religionists across borders. It made Catholicism transnational. The second theological impulse was something called Catholic Action, which was unleashed in 1922 by Pope Pius XI as a social uplift movement. But increasingly throughout the 1930s, it became more and more associated with anti-communism. And so the idea was, if you were anti-communist, then if you were publicly anti-communist, then you were being also publicly Catholic. And so the problem is that during the period, you had a baked-in anti-Semitism baked into Catholicism, because Catholics were still dealing with the problem of the deicide, the killing of Christ. And the theology during the 1930s and 40s was blame for the killing of Christ on Jews. And so they saw this, these Catholics combined Judaism and Bolshevism after the Russian Revolution in 1917. They said, okay, Marx's grandfather was a rabbi, Lenin was Jewish, the first Politburo was filled with secular Jews. And so these Catholics saw godless, advancing global communism as Jewish generated. And so you had this idea that the Jews killed Christ. Now it becomes synonymous. That's the theology. And then this becomes synonymous with the communists killing Christ. And as far as they could see, the communists were trying to kill the institutional church, because communist regimes in both Mexico in the 1920s and Spain in the 1930s were physically harming many Catholics and members of the church in those countries. So that's what Coughlin glommed onto, and that's how he kind of brought about this this movement. And so this is their main grievance claim, and it's transnational and it's theological in nature. So that's the other thing I try to do. I like to say, if you try to write this as pure political history, you're really missing the underlying impulse. You're trying to look at why people do the things that they do. And if you secularize it, in other words, take religion out of it, you really don't understand why they're doing what they're doing, because they are true believers. And so you have to know what they believe. In New York, Coughlin's Christian Front organization devised a plan to overthrow the government of the United States, which they felt President Roosevelt was peppering with communists. They felt Jewish members of the cabinet, Jewish members of the Supreme Court were all closet communists, and therefore the government needed to be purged. So in the spring of from January of 1940, 17 members of the Christian Front organization were arrested in New York City for devising and charged with sedition, trying to overthrow the government of the United States. They were caching bombs and weapons in their basement of their apartments in Brooklyn. They were making bombs in those apartments. They were using military grade weaponry to cache weapons. And this was I think this was the first kind of sedition charge until last week with the Oath Keepers and the seditious conspiracy charge from the Department of Justice. And again, no one's heard about this case. I mean, it just basically dropped off the radar in the summer of 1940 after they were basically acquitted because, and keep in mind too, the Christian Front had about 100,000 members. And within it, it had secret paramilitary cell units called action committees. So these guys with the rifles, and they're carrying Springfield 1903 rifles. That's a bolt action rifle that shoots a 30-06 round, which is about a 3-inch round, full metal jacket. Each one of those bullets will go through a brick wall. And in fact, those rifles are more lethal than the NATO round that the US Army carries today. It's just the US Army uses the NATO round because they can carry more of them. So this is what kind of interested me when I was an undergraduate. I saw pictures of these folks and I thought, why hasn't anybody written anything about them? And in the Q&A, I can answer that question a little bit further. But I always had these people in the back of my mind as people I needed to figure out and people I needed to track down and perhaps write a book about. There's this that came up on the screen. It's interesting that in one of the FBI documents at one of their shooting sessions, their target practices, they woke up at 6 a.m. on a Sunday morning, did target practice for about 2 hours, then broke to go to mass in the local town, and then came back and did more military rushes at their target practice site. I just kind of thought that was kind of funny. They also, very interestingly, they read from the Talmud during their target practices because they felt they needed to know what motivated the enemy. So they would take about a half an hour to an hour to have the Talmud explained to them during their target practicing. It's just wild stuff. They tried to, so they came up with this plan that they were going to detonate bombs all across New York City and blame those bomb detonations on the Communist Party of the USA. Then use that kind of terror trick to force the governor to call out the National Guard. And then most of these members of the Christian Front were also members of the National Guard. And they would rise up along with the National Guard and kind of put down this alleged communist insurrection that was taking place. It was a wild scenario. And of course, the FBI was able to get an informant inside the group. And the informant said that at a certain time, they're going to start detonating bombs, kind of practice round of detonating bombs. The FBI swooped down before they could do that because they didn't want to lose the evidence. They didn't want them to explode the bombs in practice runs so they could have evidence. Problem was there weren't any counterterrorism laws on the books at that time. Secondly, there was a rule in the U.S. Army Code that said that if you were a member of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, you could provide your NRA, a copy of your NRA identity card to the Department of War, and they would ship those Springfield 1903 rifles, weapons of war, to your local armory. And then for an extra $1.35, the armory would ship it to your doorstep. So that's how they got their weapons. There was this regulation in the Army Code that allowed members of the National Rifle Association to cache weapons, kind of military grade weaponry sent to your doorstep. You could also buy cordite, which is an explosive. So that's how they made their bombs. When the government went to prosecute the case, they charged them with sedition, but the sedition charge they knew was going to be tough to nail them down on because they were in Brooklyn and the Capitol was in Washington, which is unlike today because the activity today was taking place right at the Capitol. But they were convinced. Director Hoover and Edward Tam, the deputy director, were convinced that they could get them on theft of military weaponry from US armories. Each charge was a 35-year sentence. They were convinced about that until Hoover was informed by an anonymous letter from a citizen that these weapons could be purchased through the Department of Civilian Marksmanship of the Department of War. The FBI knew nothing about it, and the government's case just fizzled. And they, all of them, and so what you had was this revolt plot, which was quite complex, I believe, and religiously driven, kind of just actually blew up in the faces of the government, and they lost the case. And so the 17 plotters were reunited with their guns and their families. They got their guns back. The judge had to give them their guns back. And then there was kind of jubilation in New York as they were more or less exonerated. Now, the problem was the case in New York was so lengthy and well covered in the press that the Christian Front couldn't do a restart or couldn't boot up again in New York City. There was too much surveillance by the local police and by the FBI. So what happened was it moved to Boston, and it was there, met with this is the paramilitarism component that I talk about in the book. And one interesting point, I'm going to backtrack a little bit. While the case was being adjudicated in New York, while the trial was going on, the Christian Front had infiltrated the Natick Armory, and they'd stolen 2 Browning light machine guns, which is a kind of a super weapon of the day. It shoots 300 rounds a minute, 30-06 shells. Basically, that weapon was used by many air forces up through the 1980s to arm their air forces. They were put into the wings of airplanes for strafing runs for many small countries' air forces. Two of those weapons were stolen from the Natick Armory, and the National Guard was questioned about the theft by the FBI. The National Guardsmen refused to cooperate with the FBI, and the local FBI agent in charge refused to tell FBI Director Hoover, because all of them were afraid of losing their job. And the SAC, Special Agent in Charge in Boston, was afraid that if he let go, that there were 2 Browning light machine guns unaccounted for in Boston, he was afraid that the Boston Police Department would go on strike. And because there was no counter weapon, they simply couldn't. I mean, there's no way you can, once you have this military grade weaponry unaccounted for, there's no counter weapon for the police. So there was corruption at the highest levels of the Massachusetts National Guard, and there was corruption at the highest level of the local FBI. And so while the case was being adjudicated and they were actually trying to argue weapons theft, they actually did have these 2 more or less super weapons that were stolen from an armory and were unable to be purchased through that NRA loophole. And yet the corruption at the FBI kept all of that silent. And not until this day did we know about that. So it's shut down in New York because of the trial, comes back into Boston. Here's Francis Moran. He is a very interesting figure. He grew up in Dorchester. He's the youngest of 11, or the oldest of 11 children. He's the most bookish in the family. What that means is usually tagged for the priesthood. Very smart intellectually. Instead of joining the local parish priesthood, he goes to a seminary in New York run by the Franciscans. They're a mendicant order. They're basically into poverty and austere living. And he joins the Franciscans. And the interesting thing about his seminary, where he is for about 3 years, is that the friars who staffed that seminary had been evicted by Bismarck in the Kulturkampf. And they'd come over to New York and set up this seminary in the Callicoon, New York. And one of the things that happened was he went to the seminary, became very well educated in Catholic theology, which was kind of tinctured with this anti-communism, but he also learned fluent German because the seminary was dominated with German piety. He left after about 3 years, and he was coming up on his vows, his final vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience. I think it was the celibacy issue that kind of made him discern his way out of that seminary, and he comes back to Boston. So he's entirely theologized. He is fluent in German. He is an admirer of German culture, and he's an anti-communist, and very active. He gets a job as an insurance salesman at John Hancock Life Insurance. But then by the late 20s, early 30s, one of his bosses is replaced, and his boss is Jewish. His new boss is Jewish, and he ends up having a fist fight on the floor of the insurance company with his boss, Meltzer. You can read about this in the book, and he ends up out of a job. And so at the same time, Father Charles Coughlin is visiting Boston for a political rally, and he signs on with Father Coughlin to be his political organizer in Boston. In the book, you'll find out kind of his approaches to the Archdiocese of Boston, which don't work out. Anyway, during his period of organization, he needs help in organizing in order to get traction in Boston, and along comes Herbert Scholes. Herbert Scholes comes to Boston in 1938. Herbert Scholes, very interesting character. This is his bloodline in Nazism. Herbert Scholes was recruited into the Nazi Party by Ernst Röhm, who, along with Adolf Hitler, founded the Brown Shirts, the Sturmabteilung. And Scholes and Röhm have a close relationship. And Röhm sponsors him until late 1933, when Scholes, because he goes to Leipzig and gets a PhD in psychology, which is actually a PhD in the philosophy of Nazism. You can read about that in the book. It's fascinating. Because Scholes has a PhD, and Himmler, the head of the SS, is looking to bring numbers and prestige to the SS, because by 1934, Röhm's group, the SA, had about almost 5 million members, whereas Himmler was into the thousands. He needed prestige people, and he recruited Herbert Scholes to become away from Röhm, underneath Röhm's nose, really fascinating, and made him a member of the SS. His first job in the SS was working as an aide de camp, you can read about this in the book, to Rudolf Hess, the deputy Führer. So it's kind of like Scholes gets his first job as a Nazi, his first kind of desk job as a Nazi. He's only one step removed from Hitler. And this is he's a pantheon of people that are influencing him. He's the guy that ends up in Boston in 1938 to run these spy operations, and he's the one who ultimately recruits Moran. Now, the thing is, what nobody knows is everybody thought, why is Scholes coming to Boston? They thought that he had been demoted in the Nazi Party, because really, if you're anything in the Nazi Party, you want to be assigned to the embassy in Washington, not to some consulate in Boston. But what the press and what no one knew until now is that Scholes was sent here by Himmler to do a specific operation to clamp down on this person, Heinrich Brüning, the former chancellor of Germany, who was living in Boston. Most people don't even know that. Hitler's predecessor, he was the Weimar Republic chancellor, but his almost immediate predecessor as Chancellor of Germany was teaching in the political science department at Harvard and giving kind of robust speeches against Hitler throughout the Eastern Seaboard. And that's why Scholes was sent here. So he was a heavyweight. They sent him here, and you can read about it in the book, the intimidation campaign he runs against Brüning. Brüning becomes a significant figure in the whole puzzle, because Brüning shows up again in 1945 and actually has an interesting reconnection with his persecutor, Herbert Scholes. And so Scholes was successful in shutting up Brüning. He basically indicated to Brüning that the Gestapo knew where all of his family members lived in Germany, and if he didn't shut up, he didn't have to say, that's all he had to say to Brüning. This is Herbert again, during the period where he was in Boston. They called him Handsome Herbert. So the FBI was extremely inept in handling Scholes. The intelligence unit of the State Department, for example, knew everything about all of his adulterous affairs in Boston. That was tracked incessantly. But the FBI knew nothing about his spying. The FBI, in this narrative, the FBI comes off as standing for fabulous but incompetent. Scholes basically ran circles around them. And so we're only really able to find out now. And in the book, I list a number of the different spy operations that Scholes ran successfully while he was in Boston. Many of them, I argue, of great importance. And you can read about that in the book. Yeah, for one reason, he blew up a ship in Boston Harbor. I've got him on that. And the FBI had no clue. U.S. naval intelligence had no clue. Everybody was looking in the other direction. Here's Scholes in Boston at the consulate on Chestnut Street. This is a photograph of the German consulate on Chestnut Street in 1940. That flag was flown from May to July of 1940, from the invasion of the Low Countries until the summer of 1940. And that's where Moran starts meeting secretly with Scholes in that consulate by the summer of 1940. I was able to figure that out through an interrogation report from the Department of Justice interrogated Scholes after the war, and he spilled the beans on the whole thing of his relationship with Moran. That's what really raised my eyebrows. I thought I needed to start working on it. This is just a schematic of things going on with the Christian Front. You can look at that and read it. Christian Front membership in New England, about 30,000 in 1941. Now that's pretty good for a movement that kind of vacillated anywhere from the low thousands. The FBI had one estimate that it was 100,000 strong in 1939. The Nazis were paying him money. He goes on speaking tours. He basically, they started, once he joins hands with Scholes, he becomes a complete professional as an agent of Nazi Germany. And the thing is, both historians and particularly the national security apparatus knew nothing about this. They weren't able to prosecute him. The national security people tried to prosecute that. A sedition trial, for example, started in 1942. They put on trial a bunch of people that had hardly anything to do with Nazi intelligence. Meanwhile, Moran, who was actually violating, the Foreign Agents Registration Act, he actually was an agent of a Nazi SS officer. They couldn't figure him out. I mean, he basically ran circles around him. So these are the 4 federal intelligence agencies that were surveilling the Christian Front in Boston. And then the 5th here is the Boston Police Department. They're also the Boston Police Department don't come off very well. They're rather corrupt. They do a lot of breaking and entering into various Christian Front offices and steal stuff, violating the 4th Amendment anyway. And so I learned more about Scholes and Moran from Office of Naval Intelligence and U.S. Army counterintelligence than I do from the FBI. The interesting thing, Office of Naval Intelligence was hot on the trail of Scholes. The officer who was in Boston, the naval commander of the 9th District, kept sending memos to his boss in Washington saying, we gotta get more on Scholes. We gotta nail Scholes. He shelved everything because his boss in Washington thought that the admiral in Boston was a Nazi spy himself. It's crazy stuff. So Scholes and Moran run roughshod because of all this intelligence ineptitude for years and years. Then up here I have a look at First Amendment. I think First Amendment questions come in here. 5th Amendment questions come in here. All sorts of crazy things. Then there's this other crazy episode where Scholes pushes Moran and the Christian Front to argue for that the U.S. government adopt this semi-automatic rifle called the Johnson rifle, which no one's ever heard of, but but it was in many ways, it was a better rifle than the M1 Garand, which was already adopted by the US, which would later become adopted by the US military. But in 1940, in the spring and summer of 1940, the US War Department was trying to figure out what gun to adopt. And the Nazis had the plans for the Johnson rifle. They couldn't get the plans for the M1 Garand. So they wanted the US to adopt the Johnson rifle. And right in the middle of all this is Francis Moran and the Christian Front. They're writing letters to politicians. They're kind of bringing speakers in at meetings. They're trying to push Congress to adopt this rifle. So you got this religious organization talking about the rifle adoption. Boston College plays a role. Of course, there's always a Jesuit in the middle of things. In June of 1940, a Jesuit at BC, after the trial in New York is stopped, the Jesuit at BC goes on the radio and tells Catholics that they are now permitted to join the Christian Front if they want to. Because in spite of the Christian Front being anti-Semitic, at least they're anti-communist. This broadcast goes up and down the East Coast, and it's monitored by British intelligence. Sir William Stevenson, who is in New York, British passport control, he's the head British agent in the United States. Some say that he was Ian Fleming's model for James Bond. We'll see more about that. And the British start a spy operation to recruit Bostonians to try to undermine the Christian Front. One of them is a priest at Boston College, a priest now that they will try to recruit is Father John Louis Bond, who, among other things, was the theater professor who taught Leonard Nimoy, who later became Mr. Spock. So it's great to be able to get Mr. Spock into this story. So here we go. This is what the British are doing. These are just some amazing kind of copies of telegrams that I found, and I can talk about why they're copies later. They're thinking about forming an Irish-American group to defend democracy. This is all top secret stuff from British intelligence archives that I just wanted to show you because I think it's really interesting. All these code names and they're trying to, 48,000 is the code name for Stevenson. That's because there were 48 states in the US and he had, 000 complete control. And so this is what they're doing. And they ultimately come up with a group called the Irish American Defense Association, which has its headquarters in the Little Building, right downtown Boston, not just across the street from the Public Garden. And they finally find, it's a beautiful building, by the way. It's right near the Ritz-Carlton, actually. They recruit a woman who's a news reporter in Boston. And she runs a little newspaper called the Boston City Reporter. She's very civil rights minded. She's also an Irish Catholic, but she's a liberal Irish Catholic. And they recruit her through a cutout. So she doesn't know she's being recruited by British intelligence. They recruit her to run this new group, this Irish American Defense Association, which is supposed to be the foil to the Christian Front. And they want that organization to move the local police. In other words, they don't want the FBI involved. They don't want the US government involved. They want to push on the street level. They want to get the Boston police to arrest Moran and put him in jail. This is a case, by the way, of what I call or other historians call non-adversarial spying. All of this is illegal. The British should not be doing this. In fact, I argue that this is the first time that we really see a definitive British intelligence operation run illegally on American soil. So yes, the British have come back to Boston and they do it in 1941. The British are coming, the British came and they set up their little front organization here. This is Frances Sweeney. She does a great job of persuading through writing letters to the editor, through picketing of Christian Front meetings, through organizing groups to be more vocal against the Christian Front. Again, she has no idea she's working for British intelligence, but this is what she does. She raises awareness about the venom of the Christian Front. And she does this, I argue, largely for religious purposes. She believes that anti-Semitism on the part of Catholics is sinful. And that's why she's doing this. And so she's very efficient. She's an excellent organizer. excellent public speaker, and she's really quite a foil to Moran. You can read more about her in a book, well worth reading, about Frances Sweeney. This is this is when I knew I had a book. These are the secret special operations executive records, the copies of the records. This is about the recruitment of Father Bond from Boston College. This is when Bond, of course, was the professor who taught Leonard Nimoy, one of his first theater teachers. And they tried to recruit him because Bond was such a great public speaker himself. But Bond demurred because for First Amendment issues, he felt that well, you can get into that in the book, but it's really interesting there. These are just, files I found. This is original files from Boston, from Boylston Street, that were in the secret files in London of British intelligence. I mean, when I opened up this file, I was like, man, I think I got a book now, because I was just working with the Nazi espionage part and religion. Now I've got British intelligence doing an illegal operation, and I've got religion at the center. And it's from now coming to you all the way from downtown Boston. So it's global, it's local, it's Catholics, it's Nazis, it's spies everywhere, and it's really kind of cool. And so what they did was, again, this is Joe Timilty, then the police commissioner. He's a big friend of Joe Kennedy's. In fact, he got that job mainly because of Joe Kennedy. So Sweeney and her group pressure Timilty to move in and take down Moran at a meeting of the Christian Front, where Moran was holding up books that were written by a German propagandist who had not been indicted, but was who had been indicted but not convicted. Timilty had the Boston police detain Moran and take him down to police headquarters, and they had an hour-and-a-half detention meeting, which did not result in Moran's arrest, but got him taken off the street. Timilty was very chuffed about this. He thought it was his duty to do that. The Attorney General of Massachusetts and the local FBI chief went ballistic, because that meant that Moran was going to go underground and they would never be able to monitor his public utterances, and that they felt he was probably a deeper threat going underground than he was above ground. And so then they detained, as I said, Boston police detained him, but they didn't arrest him. This guy comes up on the scene, someone no one's ever heard of, J. Franklin Carter. He is the personal intelligence chief to President Roosevelt. He's got an office in the West Wing, and he starts writing memos to the president that he's visited with John W. McCormick, the congressman from Moran. And he writes memos to President Roosevelt saying, basically indicating that Moran could inspire someone to assassinate him. And so therefore, he's kind of putting in the mind of the president that Moran not just ought to be detained, but ought to be arrested. One of my questions was, why is this heat coming on? Because Carter was never into domestic issues. He was always dealing with foreign intelligence, foreign policy issues. But in this case, he breaks and goes domestic. Then about 10 years ago, I was reading a journal that I subscribed to since I was like 15, the International Journal of Intelligence and Counterintelligence, which pretty much indicates that Carter, who worked in the White House, was a controlled agent of Soviet military intelligence, the GRU. So the Russians wanted Moran off the scene and in jail. So now you had Nazis, you had British spies and James Bond running around Boston. Now you've got the Russians, and it's all and so in fact what happens is true. Moran does go underground, and while he's underground, he's in many ways more devious. I can't prove it, but he's got a shortwave radio. He denies that he's in touch with Scholes. Scholes has moved on. He's now working in Italy with the Waffen-SS. He's aide-de-camp to Karl Wolff, the highest ranking SS general in Italy. And in my view, Scholes is calling the shots in Boston with Moran. And what emerges is some history that other historians have written about, namely Stephen Norwood at the University of Oklahoma, who's written about the Catholic on Jewish riots in the fall of 1943. There was incredible rioting going on. These gangs, which I argue, you have to read about it in the book, how that all happens. But basically, I think Moran's at the bottom of all this. He's working with Scholes, orchestrating this all, and he's underground and doing devious work really until 1945, when the FBI kind of closes the case because their informant who got into the underground network of the Christian Front refused to testify in a court of law. That informant actually communicated with the director of the FBI saying that they would not testify in a court of law against Moran because they were afraid for their life. And so the case fizzled. The FBI ended up closing their case against Moran in 1947. Maybe talk about that a little later in the Q&A. But I'll end with this little quote from Frances Sweeney, who dies suddenly and tragically of a heart attack while she's walking down the street in downtown Boston at age 37 in 1944. This is a snippet from her fiance who wrote a letter about her, and it says, he's writing about Sweeney. It just doesn't seem right that one who could see so much evil around her and spared neither time nor courage to fight it should suddenly be taken away. To us who are left behind, her deeds should be a challenge to carry on the good work she started. And the good work that she started was actually being prescient and understanding Catholic anti-Semitism as sinful. And that's the determination that won't come for another 20 years with the arrival of Vatican II. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Gallagher. I can attest this is a fascinating book, and there is all this sort of the spies and the cloak and dagger stuff, and the FBI and international forces at play. But it's also a very detailed look at the specific, unique idiosyncratic forces in Boston that allowed this movement to take root here. So I recommend to the audience that you get a copy of the book, and we will share with you how to do that in due course. But let's take a few minutes for your questions. One overarching question, of course, and I as a lifelong Bostonian am astonished that I do not know this history. I'm shocked by that photo of the Nazi flag on Beacon Hill. And so why don't we know this story? And you did say earlier that, no one has written about this, and you saw, you sort of cracked the story, but why is it that this has sort of been buried? Oh, you're muted.
Yeah, so that is a great question. In fact, it's kind of the generational question of the project. When I was an undergraduate at Marquette, when I was 19 years old, I went to my professor and I said, he was a professor on national security issues. I said, I want to write a term paper, the usual 10-page term paper on this topic. And he said, no. He said, I don't want you to write a term paper on that. And I said, why not? Because I was looking at the newspaper coverage, and you had these Catholics carrying weapons. And at the same time, I was being trained as a police officer at the Nantucket Police Force, only as a summer cop. But they were training me on semi-automatic weaponry. And I saw these guys standing with Springfield 1903s, and I knew what a 30-06 shell could do. I thought, these guys are armed to the teeth. Why wouldn't we want to look at this? And he said, well, they didn't do anything. They didn't detonate any bombs. They and the trial fizzled. In other words, both sides were losers. So the Christian Front at the case were losers. They actually, you have to read about it in the book, how they treated religion. They actually excised religion. The Christian Front defense team was able to take religion entirely out of the courtroom. And so that defanged, in my view, it defanged the government's case about the fanaticism of these people. So they were kind of losers. They got an acquittal. It was really a nolo pros, but they got their guns back, but they couldn't really do anything. And the government also lost, because it was a great embarrassment for them to charge sedition and not get a conviction. And not only that, to charge weapons theft from armories and have all of those charges dropped because of that crazy NRA loophole. So both sides lost. And of course, the institutional Catholic Church, the church we think about, the Church of Cardinal O'Connell, the church of the, of the large steeple and people in the pews, the institutional church, the priests in the parish, they didn't want to mention it. It was unseemly after the liberation of the camps. After the liberation of the camps, for Catholics, this organization doesn't become the sort of organization historians want to write about. And so the original effort to shove it under the rug by the people in real time was successful. And it was only because I just thought I needed to keep digging. And I was just persistent. I was like a man on a mission. It's like, I got to figure these guys out. And in fact, the Jewish Community Relations Council papers at the Heritage Center were amazing. So many leads came from there. And as you'll see in the book, really the documentation there was excellent.
Great to hear. So you have said that this book took you 10 years to write. And your research was clearly extensive. Can you tell us a little bit about your research process and the range of repositories and sources that you used?
Yeah. So just to put it in perspective, the reason that I think the main reason it took so long was it took me 2 years to get the Christian Front. It took me a year to find the Christian Front FBI file, and then about 2 years to get it released. I should say as well that the declassification section of the FBI was terrific. I mean, this was all pre-COVID, and they really spent an incredible number of hours and agents to actually go through the document. It was one of the largest files in their inventory at that time. It was 2,500 pages long. It was as big as their file on Martin Luther King Jr. and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. So they took a great deal of time. Then once I was able to index that file and it branched out into all others, became like a spider web of information. I knew I needed to get Scholes's FBI file released. In as much as the FBI in many ways was not great at their analysis of what Scholes was doing, they still had reports coming in about him from other sources. That also took 2 years to get released, and then about 18 months. And then I knew that I needed to request Moran's FBI file. Scholes's FBI file was 950 pages long. Moran's was about 750 pages. So all of these took between 18 months and 2 years to be released. And I remember talking to some other historian friends. I almost like needed to talk to historians as a support group. So like waiting for these files to be released from the FBI. It's like, oh, I'm never going to get anything done. And it's, my project is floundering because I have to wait. So, and the thing is, you never know when they're going to give you the file or if they're going to give you the file. So you just have to wait and wait and wait. So, part of the things I have to do as a Jesuit priest is pray. So I did a lot of praying during that period. Then I needed to go, I knew I needed to go to Germany. And so I applied for a grant from the Klaus Center for Constitutional Democracy at Boston College. They gave me a nice grant to go do research at the political archives of the Third Reich and to interview some people who had been around at the time when Scholes was around. And I was able to do those interviews. And that was a tremendous help. And then also to go to London to get those documents, look in those documents that we saw from British intelligence. In fact, the story behind those documents even being released is an amazing story in the first place. I write about that in the book. Just kind of the archival experience is kind of cloak and dagger in its own right.
We have so many questions coming in, and we'll take just another couple. There is great interest in what happened to, first of all, one person asks, was Sweeney's death ever thought to be nefarious? And we also have interest in what happened to Moran and Scholes hereafter, after this period.
I have talked with people in the intelligence community who have said that I should look into Sweeney's death being nefarious. However, all of the reporting of the day seems to indicate that she did have a congenital health issue with her heart. And so it seems to be on the up and up. And yeah, so, you know, I mean, I think it's, I think her health issues were so well known to her friends at the time that it seems as though that could have happened. As far as Moran goes, he's on record with informant T1, who's the one that wouldn't go on the stand. He's on the record with her saying that he wants to recruit US Army veterans when they come back from the war to start a revolution to kill Jews, because US Army veterans know how to handle weapons and that they'll be perfect for his next revolution that he wants to have. It's wild. He talks in exterminationist language, even by 1945. That you know, he's delusional by that point. And by 1947, the last public record we have of him is he's driving a taxi cab in Boston. He picks up two brothers in a taxi cab in South Boston, and they stick him up. I don't know whether it was with a gun or a knife. Of course, then my brain's like, I'm from Boston, like, was that Whitey and any of his brothers? You know, that's the last kind of newspaper article we have is about his taxi cab stick up from 1947. Then it seems he worked at the Boston Public Library as a clerk for at least a year or two, and then went back into the insurance, tried his hand at insurance again, insurance sales, but basically lived a quiet life. He was never a public person after 1945. He blamed his inability to get a job on communists, and that was it. Scholes ends up, well, read the epilogue on Scholes. It's pretty amazing. He ends up getting a pension from the new Democratic Republic of Germany because he was able to convince them. He was a very charming guy. He was able to convince them that he wasn't a Nazi. He was actually a diplomat, and that he needed a state pension. So he got a state pension, went back. He went down to Latin America, of course, went down to Bolivia after the war and lived in Cochabamba until the late 1950s, and then went back to Germany and lived in a villa on the shores of Lake Starnberg outside of Munich, which is a very affluent place, until his death in 1985.
Thank you. One more question, and I know we're over time, but I think this is important, and people do want to hear this from you. Can you make the connection between this history and what is happening today with far-right groups? Can you make that link for us?
Yeah, so I think this is in terms of anti-Semitism in American society. And I think that people who are elites and people who are academics and otherwise, and people who who are well-educated. They understand the kind of poison of anti-Semitism. And I think there's a lot of great talk going on at 30,000 feet. But I'm not sure that has, so the reason I say that is the group that I study, they're at the street level. They're at the neighborhood level. None of them have, they don't have college educations. They're barely making it in the working world. They're working class Catholics and working class Christians. And they're intellectually curious, but they're not academically trained. And it's those folks, I think, that really need to hear the message about the beauty of Catholic-Jewish relations and teaching, about the respect for Jews that Christians and all religions ought have for Jews. And that's at the level where I think in today's age, that's where I think there might be a gap, is that the elites kind of can figure it out, but I think the message about the terrible nature of anti-Semitism today needs to be figured out at the street level, because this is where these folks lived, and that's where they were able to generate these awful ideas.
Thank you so much. I wish we had time for the many, many more questions that came in. Thank you all for your great interest. It's an incredible book. We do want to share information from the publisher, Harvard University Press, on how to get a discount on purchasing the book. You will also receive this link in a follow-up email following this presentation. Professor Gallagher, thank you so much for your time. This was fascinating, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you. I also want to thank our partners and our Copley Square neighbors, the State Library of Massachusetts and Boston Public Library, and I'll turn it over quickly to Beth and Diane to tell us about their upcoming events. Beth?
Thank you, Professor Gallagher. So much of the story that you talked about tonight took place very close to where all three of us work, very close. And through your research and writing, you've given us all a lot to think about. So I hope you, and I hope all of our audience members tonight will feel welcome to visit us in the State House after the State House reopens. We have wonderful collections, and while we're not yet reopened to the public, we are providing all of our services remotely. So you can go right to our website and find great descriptions of our collections, many of which are available digitally, and the services that we can offer you while the State House is closed. So our collections, as you'll see on the screen, cover a wide variety of formats and subjects, but most of our holdings relate to the history of Massachusetts and the history of its government. So you're welcome to contact us for any of your research questions. And there are some links in the chat if you need them. So we do have several events coming up in the near future. Monday, February 28th, we'll be joining with a number of local public libraries that you can see listed here for a talk by Gerald Walker on his new book, How to Make a Slave and Other Essays. And then a month later, on Tuesday, March 29th, we'll be holding a panel discussion with 3 authors from our local Beacon Press's Revisioning History series, and this will be hosted by the Boston Public Library. So we hope you can join us for both of these events, and then keep an eye on our website for information about other upcoming talks. And our social media is full of really interesting information as well. So thank you all for being here tonight. And Diane, over to you for closing remarks from the Boston Public Library.
Thanks, Beth. You can visit the Boston Public Library in person or on our webpage at www.bpl.org for online resources, including our catalog, databases, ebooks, magazines, newspapers, movies, music, and more. We answer questions live and through chat, email, and telephone, but it's preferable to use email for more involved questions. An upcoming virtual author talk with the Boston Public Library on January 31st is an abolitionist handbook with Patrice Cullors. You can see all our events at bpl.org/events. Thanks again, Charles, for an excellent talk, and to everyone for coming and participating. And over to you, Rachel.
Thank you again. I'd like to let everyone know about a couple of upcoming events with the Jewish Heritage Society. We are co-sponsoring a fascinating documentary theater piece on this Saturday night about Jewish immigration in the face of anti-Semitism. And of interest to this audience, I think, on March 17th, St. Patrick's Day, we are hosting a program with Hosea Diner of New York University about the entwined history of the Irish and the Jews, two of America's most influential immigrant groups. So we hope you'll visit our website, jewishheritagecenter.org, to learn more about those programs and other activities with the Jewish Heritage Center. Thank you to all of you in the audience this evening. Thank you to our speaker. Thank you to our co-sponsors. As you leave this program, you will be asked to take a brief survey about it. We hope you'll take just a minute to fill that out, as your feedback is very valuable to helping us develop further programming. And we will also be sending, as I mentioned earlier, a follow-up email with a link to this presentation and to the publisher discount to purchase the book. I invite you to learn more about the Weiner Family Jewish Heritage Center on our website. And I do want to mention that this free program was made possible by contributions to the Jewish Heritage Center and to New England Historic Genealogical Society from people all over the world. We ask you to please consider making a donation of your own. Thank you. We hope you'll join us again for our upcoming programs. Until then, stay healthy and be well. Goodbye until next time.